Wherever you are, good evening, good morning, goodness to you. Welcome to 10 Questions. What is humor? Why humor? Well, a good laugh is something we could all probably benefit from right about now, but don't look at me. For you students, it's week 7 of our 10-week quarter, and having just made it through midterms and seeing finals around the bend, I bet you could use some levity. And for all of us, having made it through an incredibly divisive election, only to be facing a massive resurgence of COVID-19 across the nation, the continued work of our collective communities lies ahead. A little lightness could lift our spirits and help us in that work. Let's take a moment and consider people who have made us laugh, who have lifted us up through humor. Perhaps a friend or one of the great humorists of our time. Would you take a moment to put into the chat names of people who have made you laugh? Let's open that chat and say their names. People who made you laugh well, laugh hard, laugh so hard you cried. Let's put their names there. And while we're sharing tonight, I have a special request. It means so much to us to hear from you, but please use your discretion in the chat so that we don't distract from the evening's presentations and discussion. However, if you're still thinking of the names of people who've made you laugh, just keep filling them in. What makes something funny? That we laugh may be universal, but humor is context specific. Context matters. It matters who's telling a joke, when it's being told, and to whom, and for what purpose. Who or what is it about? Intention matters too. This week, students in 10 Questions are viewing the work of Vaginal Davis, an American performing artist, painter, independent curator, composer, filmmaker, and writer. Vaginal Davis is an icon of the disruptive performance aesthetic, sometimes referred to as terrorist drag. And she uses her drag persona to challenge social norms and push up against neat categories of identity. Davis's performances have been described in print as giddy, satirical stabs at the old world order, leveling criticism at white privilege and the patriarchy with nuanced wit and game show style camp. Sometimes, as with the work of Vaginal Davis, humor is a way of getting under the skin of old world orders so as to change them. Humor can reveal experience or collective truths that might otherwise be concealed. It can level sharp critiques at politics, politicians, and power structures by creating productive discomfort and by changing who has control of what gets said. And depending upon who is in control, humor can make use of stereotypes and bias, lifting up some by denigrating others. As a choreographer professor, one of the problems I like to ask my students to solve is to make a dance that both fulfills and upends expectations. Often, the results make us laugh. How is expectation and surprise a root of humor, if it is at all? And one more question. You know those Greek masks of tragedy and comedy that frame a binary of classical theater? What's the relationship between tragedy and comedy? Are they in some way sisters to each other? Inside out versions of one another? For those who are joining us for the first time, 10 Questions is a course offered by UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture and simultaneously a public platform for thoughtful engagement with our extended community. It's here with you that 10 Questions brings together the resources of the university to build capacity in this time of urgent need and great precarity. The format for this evening will include a 10-minute presentation from each of our 3 panelists, followed by conversation amongst them. Our students will then immediately gather in small group discussions in Zoom breakout rooms, and everyone else will remain here in the webinar for some specially curated mid-program entertainment. We'll then welcome our students back and finish out the evening in a Q&A with our esteemed guests. So, our first panelist tonight is Scott Weems. Scott is a cognitive neuroscientist and author of Ha! The Science of When We Laugh and Why. Scott's career began as an officer in the US Coast Guard, where he served as a communications officer on board the United States Coast Guard ship Yocona in Kodiak, Alaska. His travels then took him to New Orleans, Boston, Los Angeles, Annapolis, and Little Rock, earning graduate degrees in psychology, education, and creative writing along the way. One of our distinguished alums, he has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA, and once made a little girl cry by telling her that some people go to school until 26th grade. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about humor. There are a lot worse topics that you could talk about for an evening than humor. So I think it's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. And maybe we can kind of all learn something too, which is what I'm looking forward to. So I guess before I introduce myself any further, I want to start, could we play the video that I have and go with that first?
I find that ducks' opinion of me is very much influenced over whether or not I have bread.
One morning, I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I don't know.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm actually celebrating something tonight. I finally just slept with my high school crush. Right? Thank you. But now he like expects me to go to his graduation. Like I know where I'm gonna be in 3 years, right? Oh, slow down. Oh, kids.
Yeah, so I like starting off with that first, just because it's a fun way to start. These are some of the best comedians, and I had to start with the Mitch Hedberg just because I was so happy to see at least one person put Mitch in the list of favorite comedians, and not many people recognize him. So that made me feel good. The whole night's been worth it just for that. Yeah, so I use these videos because they're so different. There's no way you're going to confuse a comedian like Mitch Hedberg, who's the first, with Amy Schumer, who was the last. And of course, you can go old school, and the Marx Brothers. That's it's a whole different field too. So these are very different ways of approaching the art, but yet we still classify them the same thing. We still call it humor, and that's tricky. And so I guess my role now, to introduce myself, my name is Scott, as we said, and I'm a psychologist, and I guess it's somewhat not a derogatory term, but a flippant term towards psychologists is sometimes we're called boxologists. Because what we do is we take complex phenomenon, things like humor, and we try and understand it and break it down by like drawing boxes and say, this box is comprehension, this is the punchline, and the next box is set. I guess before that would be a box for setup, and a box after that would be laughter. I don't know. We draw boxes to try and break down all the different sub processes that are happening with something like humor. With something like humor, that's incredibly difficult because there's so much going on. There's almost too many boxes to handle. But still, that's the approach I'm inclined to take just by my training. So I'm going to talk about humor as a psychologist would. And I started with the comedians, one, to show how different they are, and two, I guess to illustrate that this is my belief, and I don't think it's an uncommon one, that defining humor itself is incredibly difficult and maybe even impossible. And can we bring up that next slide, the theories slide? I'm just going to talk and keep that up. And that's not to say that a lot of people haven't tried. There have been over 2,000 years of people trying to come up with theories about humor. Plato was one of the first. He actually talked about, at first he outlawed humor, and there's a long history of that too. Humor is not very well respected, which might be why a true comedy has really never even won an Oscar. Most likely, it kind of depends on how you define a comedic movie, but it's not very well respected, and it certainly wasn't back in Plato's time. He had like superiority theory. We laugh at things that make us feel better about ourselves, and that was kind of the leading theory for a while. Then there came a whole lot of other ones where people started realizing that expectation was important. I'm not going to get into these because frankly, I don't believe them so much. At least I mean, there's good value to them. But the thing is, whenever you try and develop a theory about humor, there's so many exceptions that it becomes a really difficult task. So we can move out of that slide for now because I'm not going to get too much into it. But to recognize that I've just chosen 4 there, and I could have chosen another 10 if I wanted to. Instead of talking about humor in terms of a theory and what is a joke, I like to instead think about what's happening in our brain as we're processing the joke, because I think that's a lot more interesting, at least to me. I want to know what's happening inside our head as we get a punchline. And a good start would be like that Groucho Marx line, where yesterday I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How it got in my pajamas, I have no idea. The thing about that is, it's kind of funny. It's only like, I forgot, it's been a while since I counted, like 14 words. It's less than 20. And in that short amount of time, Groucho is setting up an expectation and then violating it. And I guess the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about humor in terms of that. There's expectations, and then there's a violation of that expectation. And this is kind of what our brain is wired to do. We are wired to expect things and to have, well, for the setup of a joke, we kind of, there's the buildup. We know something is coming, we don't know what it is. And in fact, that's kind of what a lot of life is. We think we know what's coming, and then we're surprised, and then we come up with a new theory for what's happening. And humor basically kind of manipulates that in a very entertaining and quick way. So if you ask humor scientists, what's the most important ingredient up for humor? In fact, I guess, can I call the people to chat? Just throw in the chat, what do you think is the most important ingredient for humor? And we'll kind of do this really quick as a survey, just throw out what you think is there. My bet is, okay, my chat's not showing them. There we go, okay. Truth, timing, wit, okay, delivery, surprise, context. Okay, I'm seeing the one I thought. Truth, that's kind of interesting. I hadn't expected that. Okay, so I'm gonna take a quick detour. Timing is fascinating. Timing is incredibly important for the art, but no matter, there've been about a dozen people who've tried to measure comedic timing and nothing turns out significant, nothing that they've been able to identify. From a scientific standpoint, timing is the biggest mystery. The thing that I see quite a few people saying surprise, and that's the number one answer that comes up for humor scientists, psychologists particularly. When they talk about humor, the most important ingredient is surprise. And I mean, that's not terribly surprising. When every time you have a setup and then a punchline, generally what's happening is you're shocked. You're led to believe that something's happening and then something else happens, which, like for the Groucho Marx line, at first you think Groucho is wearing the pajamas, and then you realize something's wrong, and then you've got to reconcile that. So surprise is key. And let's throw up the brain picture next. Now here's the thing about the brain. It's we talk about brain parts a lot, and what we're looking at now is basically a brain that's been cut in half down the center. And there's one part of the brain that is particularly interesting. But before I bring it up, I want to bring up a caveat that our brains are often likened to like computers. I mean, that's the kind of the leading analogy that we talk about when computers. We're like, okay, well, you've got like hard drive space. That's where your memory is, and then you've got your working memory. That's like the equivalent of RAM. And, you can go on and on about that. But the thing is, our brain is not a computer, and the big reason we're not a computer is we have no central processor. There is no boss in our brain telling the other parts what to do. That doesn't exist. If we did, then we would know a lot more about how people think. But what we do have is one part of the brain called the anterior cingulate. And I'm not going to make this a neuroscience class today because that would not be fun or funny. But it is very interesting to understand the anterior cingulate because it's fascinating. And it's that colored part in the center with the yellow, green, blue, and pink sections. We kind of divide it up into parts, but the parts don't really matter tonight. That is the part of the brain that becomes very active when we are surprised. So when you, for example, listen to Groucho Marx give a that elephant in pajamas joke, the anterior cingulate is the first part of the brain that becomes very active, and rightfully so, because it's the part of the brain that tells you when you are expecting something and you get something else. Funny thing is, it's active for a lot of things because, frankly, this is something that happens to people all the time. So although it isn't a central processor, it's pretty damn important. And it's because it's kind of like, I call it the stoplight of the brain. It's the part of the brain that tells certain parts of the brain to speak, other parts to shut up, and tries to reconcile who should be kind of doing the processing and who shouldn't based on the best guess of what is actually happening given violated expectations. Okay, so the first thing to recognize is, surprise is pretty important for humor. And the more funny a joke is, you can put people in a scanner and look at this, the more active this part of the brain is. So I don't think the important part, the take home message for this is to know, your brain anatomy, but I think it is important to recognize that our brains are wired for surprise. And humor is basically we can move out of the brain picture now. The brain is really a specialized tool for manipulating that surprise, sometimes for like entertainment purposes. I think there's a reason we enjoy jokes is because we enjoy being surprised. And we've basically adopted jokes and humor as a way to take advantage of that. And I'm hoping when we get into discussion later, if you want to ask me about the evolutionary, like why would that happen, from an evolutionary sense, it's fascinating because we are not the only animals who laugh. Apes, rats, dogs, rats laugh actually. And I've spoken to a rat researcher who tickles rats for a living to look at the laughter in rats. So yeah, we're not special in that way. And they all have the parts of the brain that register surprise like us. So we enjoy surprise. But the thing is that's not enough either. And so the other thing I think we kind of need to take away from humor is that surprise is important, but it's not everything. And if you don't believe me, then like an example I often think of is like, if you drive and just hit somebody with your car, I don't think anybody would call that funny, right? That's a felony. That's just being an ass. But there's TV shows all the time. Johnny Knoxville has made a living out of being hit by cars and stun guns and who knows what. It's because there's context matters. If you hit someone with your car, that's a felony. But if there's some sort of other expectation, whether, because it's your friend doing it and they're doing it for some other reason, or if there's some sort of maybe history there, sometimes things that wouldn't necessarily be seen as funny, we might laugh at them because there's other things going on. So context really matters. And this is where the destination is important too. All humor basically has that surprise and then that new way of thinking that comes afterwards, that resolution from the joke. For the Groucho Marx, that has to do with, and I'm going through this relatively fast, but it's a big topic, so I'm just kind of want to give the overview. But with the Groucho Marx line, yesterday I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How I got in my pajamas, I have no idea. Think about what's happening in your brain as that's happening. It fascinates me to think there's a moment when your brain is trying to picture who's wearing the pajamas. Is it Groucho or is it the elephant? And there's that one moment where the anterior cingulate is very confused, trying to figure out, well, what do I imagine in this? And then you've got to create some sort of picture at the end. And let's bring up that last slide that I have. Scientists have actually, in quite creative ways, tried to study this destination aspect of humor, this new way of thinking. And the sad thing is, I don't know how many of you have ever heard the quote from, I think it was E.B. White, who said that dissecting humor is like dissecting frogs. The subject always dies in the end, and you're just basically left with a mess. And so when you dissect jokes, there's a danger with that. So that said, let's dissect this and go, okay, so lawyer testifies in suit. I would say that's neither surprising nor makes you think anything other than, some boring lawyer in a court. Lawyer testifies in horse is confusing and is shocking, but doesn't bring you any place new. There's no destination. There's no new way of thinking after reading that punchline. But I don't know, back in the day, Jay Leno was pretty well known, not so much now because his humor hasn't really carried over to, recent years as well. But Jay Leno of The Tonight Show used to make a living out of presenting ambiguous newspaper headlines. So lawyer testifies in horse suit. I'm not going to say that's laugh out loud funny, but I would put that at least in the category of humor, because you do have a moment when you're trying to figure out what does horse suit really mean. And it's that destination, that new way of thinking that kind of leads your brain to a new resolution. And that's a different part of the brain that is responsible for that. And in fact, it brings in a whole world of knowledge that you have about the world. And it's that destination, that new way of thinking that the joke, at least a good joke, will bring you to. That's kind of why some jokes hit and some of them don't. And why some people are so offended by jokes that are, on the edge, and some people find them hilarious. I've talked to a few comedians about humor and kind of what they find funny, and a lot of them have shared, they just are not offended. There's nothing that can offend them, because in the world of comedy, they see it as comedy. It's not a personal reflection, or they say, well, there's always a hidden meaning. We're trying to understand what the comedian is actually trying to say. And I think we're probably going to get into that some tonight. And it's a controversial point, and it's something that's interesting. And I don't know if I would agree with, all cases. Before I was talking with some of the panelists about, there's, how many of you heard of Michael Richards, the guy who played Kramer, who tried to do stand-up and, launched into a very offensive tirade at the end of his very unsuccessful, performance. And basically has not done stand-up again. And there's a lot of things to take from that. One is that he may very well be a racist by what he said, but he's also a very bad comedian, because there's at least, people have said some very offensive things and gotten away with on stage, which is why I include the Amy Schumer comedy. Okay, I need to be ending up here. So ending with Amy Schumer in her bit, she basically, almost espouses, statutory rape. But I don't think many people would take her as actually being a pro-rape comedian. So I'm hoping tonight we might get into kind of the issue of, there's the message and then there's a message underneath. And a lot of that has to do with that resolving from confusion and surprise, which is the most fascinating thing I think humor makes our brains do. And I guess I'll kind of leave with that, because that's the part that interests me the most.
Thanks so much, Scott. There's so much to think about, particularly about the way language works in terms of making us laugh, that moment of surprise and then the delay as you refigure things out. And, it makes me think, as a dance person, how is it that humor works when words aren't present? I wonder if we'll get to talk with you more about that later. I hope so. But in the immediate, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dominic Taylor, a scholar of African American theater and a writer, director whose work has been seen across the country. Dominic is a professor in the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, and currently serves as acting chair of the Department of Theater. Since his arrival at UCLA, Taylor has reshaped the school's curriculum for African American theater with a cycle of courses that begin with a consideration of 1619 and go through contemporary African American life. Welcome, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I appreciate it. And yeah, I do theater, and I focus on African-American performance. And I need to make mention of one thing. This weekend, I was talking to a friend, because when you're a professor, you speak to people occasionally. And she mentioned that I mentioned that I was going to speak on humor. And she said, are you going to talk about the Greek humors or Shakespeare's humor? I said, no, I'm talking about something like funny. And she said, well, you're talking about comedy. The only reason I'm mentioning this is, like anybody who does theater, I don't want anybody to think that I'm neglecting the four humors or ancient Greek theater, but I am going to be, I guess, interchanging the words comedy and humor as we go through. And the comedy that I'm going to look at is it as a reflection of culture. And in this case, primarily African-American culture. And I think there are a couple of things that I got to say about culture. First is, so what is culture? And anybody who's had me in class knows that I use this wide definition that culture is the behavior, beliefs, and practices of a particular people at a particular time. So that's how I frame culture. But then the question that I ask is, well, a lot of people ask this, like, why are some things funny to certain people and not funny to other people? Or why do some cultures find this funny and other things aren't funny? And I'm going to focus primarily, I guess, on African-American culture in this space. But the other thing which I think is important is its function inside the culture is important. Because I think oftentimes, particularly with African-American comedy or what used to be called Negro satire or Negro humor, one of the things that people focused on was the function of the work, as well as how it worked. Like, what was the function of the work? And I think that oftentimes, or more oftentimes than not, people focused on the idea of survival as a space, or pushing back against oppression. And the thing which I say, and I'm going to use two things next to each other, as I'm going to define something, which means things next to each other. I don't think that survival is the goal of African-American comedy. I actually think it is resistance, which is a bigger, more challenging thing. And I do think the essence of comedy, I loved everything that Scott was saying, but one of the essences of comedy, is the notion of the juxtaposition. Juxtaposition can be the expected, in conversation with the unexpected. Somebody walking on a banana peel, you expect somebody to be ambulatory, then they fall, and then you discover, But let me define, so culture is the behavior, practices, and beliefs of a particular people at a particular time. And juxtaposition, as I'm going to define it, it's an act or an instance of playing close together or side by sides for comparison or contrast. So when I was looking at this topic, and I'm thinking I got a few minutes to talk to you all about comedy / humor, the first joke that popped into my mind was a joke that I attributed to Godfrey Cambridge. And it's an old joke that is, the joke goes, he walks into a segregated segregated restaurant, forgive me. And they say, we don't serve Negroes, or depending on who is telling the joke, we don't serve the N-word. And his response was, great, because I don't eat them, or eat another expletive at the back side of it. So I thought that this was a Godfrey Cambridge joke, which I thought was interesting. It's also a joke of resistance. It's also a joke of challenge. It's also a joke of a bunch of other things. But then, as I went down the rabbit hole to try to find out the source of the joke, I discovered that it was first said, apparently, by Dick Gregory a few years before that, my instance of knowing the joke. And then if one were to Google that particular joke, you probably would find an instance where Muhammad Ali said the joke in an interview. So Muhammad Ali is attributed in certain spaces, Godfrey Cambridge in my space, and Dick Gregory in other spaces. And so it is a thing that goes across, particularly, these are African-American men who told the joke. But it's significant that it's like, oh yeah, this joke has some kind of connection to a cultural space. It's not as basic as a church service, but this joke has resonance that at least 3 different men said at different times. I think the notion of resistance and survival might be, some people might argue with me. It's like, well, Dominic, aren't they the same thing? They're not particularly. I do think that the function of comedy, in terms of most African-American comedy, is not merely to acknowledge survival or to get to the next thing. It's actually to acknowledge, if you want to say this, a moment, and then move, if you want to think it forward, and be progressive. And I'm going to show an example of a comedian first to clarify this. So this is Godfrey Cambridge, which I'm going to show now. Not doing the joke that I intended, but you'll watch this quick routine.
So they try into some kind of honesty in films now, you know, like they do Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I saw that picture. Everybody told me it was supposed to be controversial. I said, what controversy? Guess Who's Coming to Dinner asks a very simple question. Can a white, wealthy, liberal San Francisco family accept the marriage of their daughter to a typical Negro? It happened to be a combination of Jonas Salk, Albert Schweitzer, and a Jolly Green Giant. What honesty? I mean, look, for example, there's that scene with Kate Hepburn and the daughter in the room where she says to the daughter, she says, did anything happen in Hawaii? And the daughter says, no, Mama, I wanted to, but he didn't. Get out. In today's permissive society, what she should have done was winked at the mother and said, Ma, have I got a new definition of black power for you?
So in that moment, there are a lot of things that are going on. And there are a lot of things standing next to each other. There are a lot of things juxtaposed in this moment. That Godfrey Cambridge is a man who is phenotypically and obviously black. He doesn't look like anything other than just a black man. So you're registering this black man. He's lost some weight before this particular moment. It was on a Diane Carroll special, but so he lost particular weight. There's, you know, some body image stuff that goes on with this, but it's really important. So Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is a film, some of you know. Sidney Poitier stars in it. The woman, Joanne, who is his wife, Catherine Houghton, is this young white woman. And it's interesting that the film was made in 1967. So the film was made in 1967, the same year as Loving versus Virginia. So you've got like social cultural stuff going on as this film is being made. Additionally, what Cambridge does in the joke is when he says, you know, can this liberal family deal with their daughter being married to a typical Negro? Who is Sidney Poitier, for crying out loud? Who, when you look at him, he looks like just, I don't know, black royalty all the time, you know, forever. It's like Sidney Poitier. But when he claims Jonas Salk, polio vaccine, Albert Schweitzer, Nobel Peace Prize, and the Jolly Green Giant, tall, handsome, wonderful man. So he's not your typical Negro. So we're juxtaposing those two things. And then when he goes into the slightly ribald moment about, you know, she should have winked at her mother and said, we've got a different definition of black power. We also had black power and the black power movement, which was scaring a lot of America. The first time black power was said, it was said by Stokely Carmichael, who was leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but also you had to deal with the notion that black power was this, you know, larger thing that had the Black Panther Party and these guys in berets in people's psyche. So he's putting a bunch of things next to each other, and you laugh for one reason, because you're just like, wow, that's really kind of strange, but is it true? Or is it something that I'm not supposed to laugh at? And then the other thing, which I think I cannot get away from, and something that I want to talk about, which is really important, that Scott mentioned as well, is the fact that it's Godfrey Cambridge telling that joke. Godfrey Cambridge delivering that joke allows it to, and he's dressed well. He's dressed in this really, you know, if I want to say this Sidney Poitier-like outfit anyway. And I think that it's interesting to think about, in terms of this moment in my thesis, for lack of a better term, how complex resistance can be. Because resistance isn't really in your face. Resistance comes in your laughter. Resistance comes in the space where it's like, that's funny. It's really kind of twisted. Oh my goodness. And then you realize where awareness is going, where tension is going, where, you know, why you laugh or even why you don't laugh. And the strange thing is people who haven't even seen Guess Who's Coming to Dinner laugh at that for a bunch of reasons. The other thing which I think is important, although this is, and I'm not going to keep you here for too long, the other thing which he goes into here, although we didn't use this kind of language at the time, was he goes into the notion of how we frame identity. Like, you know, what is a typical Negro? Is like an identity site. Like what is one, or how is one typical, if you want to hold that onto that idea, or what's a regular black person, to hold on to that notion. So, and he's not mocking it in any way. He's bringing our attention to the juxtaposition of what a typical Negro is juxtaposed to what Sidney Poitier is, or was, particularly in that film. his ability to hold those things up to us are fantastic. And I think that it furthers the notion of not just those things in conversation or standing side by side, but the other thing is the person who's delivering this being in front of it. And so the next clip I'm going to show you is of a comedian. Her name is Angela Johnson, and her Angela is spelled Anjelah, Johnson, Anjelah, which I love the fact that she spells her name that way. But she's going to embrace identity, or she's going to deal with identity in a particular way. And I just want you to see this, and then we'll talk about Angela's delivery and how she exists in this space.
I mean, for the most part, people don't even know the difference between us. They think all Latinos eat Mexican food. Ask any random white guy, hey, name a Latino dish that is not Mexican. Fajitas. No, that's Mexican. Quesadilla. No, that's also Mexican. Nacho Bel Grande. That's American. Nice try, Team Mexico, 1 point. I may think Mexicans are at the top, but I'm not the top Mexican. I still don't speak Spanish. I know. I wish I did. Any other Latinos here that do not speak Spanish? Where are you at? See, I'm not the only one. Air fives. Where are Latinos at that do speak Spanish? Where are you guys at? Oh, congratulations. You're better than us. I bet you put it on your resume too, huh? Bilingual, Spanish and English. Happy face, happy face. Well, good for you. Felicidades.
Now, Angela is funny. It's funny. There's no doubt about it. She's funny. And the start of that routine is she is a Latina, but she's a Mexican woman who's married to a Puerto Rican man. And she goes into the different, that's where we segued into the thing. And the thing that I think I wanted to bring our attention to was, so she is engaging in the unpacking of identity publicly, but she's using her own body as the site of this thing. And her as a she is a fascinating comedian for many reasons. But one of the things which I think is important is she brings a bunch of questions together, standing next to each other, like people do think all Latinas are Latinx culture morphs, but it doesn't. Her name is Angela Johnson, Anjelah. Johnson is her last name. But I do think that the one thing that I do think that one of the things which is important is, and somebody mentioned that she didn't make them laugh, which I think is also fine. I think that one of the natures of her and her comedy is she has to, if I want to say this as rudely as I can, she has to look like that to say those jokes. If she looks like Whoopi Goldberg, the jokes don't land in the same way. If she looks like Amy Schumer, the jokes don't land in the same way. She has to look like that. And the interesting thing is, as her comedic career has grown, when she started out in stand-up comedy, she actually didn't, her personage was like, she didn't want to engage in who she was as a person. So she came out and she had a big hoodie on and she had the mic and she would talk and you would never see her. So you actually removed gender question, you moved a lot of other questions. So she just became this voice. And it was interesting. I think a manager or an agent told her, just be yourself and do your comedy. Be in your space and do your comedy. And I think one of the things which is, I think one of the challenges of these things which stand next to each other is there's this bad joke called there's brother humor and then there's other humor. I've said to people sometimes, if a cow is sacred, you can't make fun of somebody's sacred cow. If you're thinking about it, like if you want to make swine humor and you're engaged in halal as your particular practice, swine humor or pig humor might not be funny for you. And I think this is one of the things which is fascinating about comedy, that certain people find certain things funnier. So I'm not saying this is the pure funny thing, but in terms of Angela Johnson's humor, I think if you're a Latinx person and you do not speak Spanish and you understand that journey of like the ownership of language to make me more Latinx or not, it's interesting to think about that connection versus me being an outsider who's just looking at it and saying, oh, that's an interesting juxtaposition of this woman and her husband, his Spanish ability, her Spanish inability, if I want to hold on to that. And I do think that the cringeworthy space, this reminds me of something else, which I want to make mention of. There's a notion that I laugh to keep from crying. I don't think that that's the case. And I definitely don't think that's the case in Black humor. And now, of course, I've extended it into multicultural humor. But I do think that one of the things that is telling about her last joke is there had to be moments of pain in which, you know, somebody's like, hey, I'll get you this role if you can speak Spanish. She's like, I don't speak Spanish. I don't. And then what does that do to her? Does that make her less, does that make her identity less or more significant? I just think it's an interesting kind of space. So one of the things I want to leave you with is culture is contextual. Oh, and the most, no, I don't want to say the most important thing, but one of the things I want you to consider when we're talking about humor is who is the performer and how is that humor performed? I think one of the grand challenges about American humor is who gets to say what, who gets to say which jokes, how do they operate? It's because of our history that certain jokes are off limits or certain things are outside of people's purview, but also the eclectic nature that we have means that certain jokes can be funnier for certain communities. And I think that that humor is, you know, part of the American question or the American journey. What the thing that I say about humor is that it shouldn't be general. It should be as specific as the food we have. And I know Angela makes the joke about it, but I do think in the same way that we have Indian food or Mexican food or Chinese food or Thai food, we can have as many different forms of comedy. Okay, that's all I wanted to leave you with for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dominic. Well, there is a lot to unpack in that, both the idea of unpacking identity, and I was just thinking that in terms of context, the ways in which you bring up that it might mean something very particular for a Spanish-speaking Latinx person, for a non-Spanish-speaking Latinx person, and for me as a non-Latinx person, it's also does a whole other set of things, which all of which are very productive. So lots to think about there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Coming back to you shortly, but now it's my pleasure to introduce our third and final panelist, Neil Garg. Neil is a distinguished professor and the inaugural holder of the Kenneth N. Trueblood Endowed Chair in Chemistry and Biochemistry at UCLA. He currently serves as chair of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. His research is directed toward the development of synthetic strategies and methods that enable the synthesis of complex bioactive molecules. Along with his colleagues in the Garg laboratory, he explores new and innovative tools in chemical education, especially those that involve the use of modern technologies. In the broader community, Garg is a popular speaker and consultant for teaching, scientific, and legal matters. Welcome, Neil.
All right, thank you so much, Victoria. Hopefully everybody can see the slides okay. Maybe. Yeah, okay, cool, thanks, Vic. Hey, I just wanna start by saying how delighted I am to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to 10 questions over the past several weeks with the family, and it's just provided a wealth of information and a lot of great things to think about. So thanks so much to Vic and Marie and the rest of the team for all you've been doing. It's really been wonderful, and it's great to be here to talk about some things I really enjoy and care about, such as humor and absolutely one of my favorites, organic chemistry. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of class participation and give anybody, especially the students, the chance to chime in here to tell us how you feel about organic chemistry. You can simply put in a 1 or a 2, depending if you're feeling pumped up and excited like Chaz, or if you're feeling a little bit worrisome like Elf. And you can also add any comments to, sorry, I'm already cracking up looking at your answers. I see quite a lot of 2s. All right, I see a couple of organic chemists putting in 1s for me. Thank you to the organic chemists who attended. Oh man, Rob Toplowski is my hero. This is great. I can't think about it anymore. Okay, so you actually see a pretty good mix here. Thank you for the participation. And it was because of OChem that made me switch to social sciences. So that's actually the type of thing that we hear far more often than educators like myself would like to hear. But it's incredibly common, I think, to think about this negative reputation of organic chemistry. So I just plugged in hardest classes in college into Google, and you can see what pops up. Right there, front and center, organic chemistry. And if you look at some of the hits, you will see organic chemistry listed as the hardest class that is offered in college, or one of the top 3 at almost any of these websites and many others that you look at. And this is a longstanding viewpoint, right? I took organic chemistry in 1997. I had heard the reputation well before that. It's supposed to be a class that involves a lot of memorization. It's supposed to be impossible. It's a class often described as a weed out class, the type of thing that'll prevent students from getting into med school. And with that in mind, it'll often crush your dreams. And this is just how it's been for a very long time. If you look at what happened in my case, I started at UCLA in 2007, huge focus on establishing a productive research laboratory. And not too long after, I jumped in to teach organic chemistry courses that look like this. So just to give you the quick scoop on this, this is Chem 14D, Organic Reactions and Pharmaceuticals. They're large classes. The enrollments approach 400 students. There's only about 360 chairs in the room. And this is the last class in the chemistry sequence for life science majors. So there's 14A, 14B, 14C, 14D. This is the last one. This is the last hurdle that these students have to jump through. And most of them are just looking to get it, wrapped up, right? So non-chemistry majors. And it's intuitive based on the reputation, but we also have data that tells us how interested students are at the beginning of the class. At the start of the class, the interest in organic chemistry, or the students that rate it high, is only about 10 to 15%. Some say it's medium, but the vast majority of students in this class will say their interest in the subject is low. And so when you think about how do you walk into a class like that and try to increase engagement and get students excited about the task, it's really quite a daunting project, if you will. And there's so many different pieces to this. And I won't go through all of these, of course, for the interest of time, but I'll say it's a lot about intellectual stimulation. So we're talking about creativity and problem solving. It's about making sure students understand the relevance. It's about providing care and support. And it's also very much about making it fun. And this is where humor can be an important asset to many of us who teach. And I'll say, I'm an organic chemist. I'm not an expert in pedagogy, but I can say for sure, humor has been well studied for decades in the context of education. If you're interested in reading about it, I can just point you to some of the reviews that are shown here on the slide. Right? But what I want to do with our time is just share with you a few things that we do, our feeble attempts at humor, to try to brighten up the classroom and increase student engagement. So one of the most important things that we do is just to establish a certain vibe on the first day of class. And this is ultimately a combination of showing students that the class is fun, but also letting them know that we are going to challenge them in this class. It's really a class about learning how to solve what might be viewed as very difficult or impossible problems. So I know there are a few organic chemists that have tuned in. I'm guessing most of you are not organic chemists. So I'll just say, if you look at something like this and that looks weird, that's normal, right? And that's actually what the students in the class would say as well when they first start. They look at that, it looks like some sort of a chemical structure, but it's actually pretty big and complex. And when we talk about these impossible problems, what we'll do is we'll ask students to think about how to make the molecule from things that are much simpler, right? And along the way, we're going to teach them a bunch of rules. But if you put it in this context and you show a student a molecule like this, that's daunting, right? But I always like to point out that students are awesome problem solvers. They love solving problems, and they recognize that this is an important skill. And so that's really what we want to develop. So our feeble attempt at humor here is to just ask the students, if you face a tough problem, what do you do? And the students will give us all sorts of good answers for this, for how they would address problems. And I'll just, say you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, and go to the board. And I'll give them the steps to problem solving. And you can see the first step is quite simply to panic, right? And everybody chuckles a little bit, but it's meant to have some truth to it, because when I see a tough problem, that's the first thing I do. I kind of panic and I think, oh my, what's happening here? And until I keep my cool and think about it and rebuild my confidence, then I can take the next steps to relax, look for clues, and do the different things we need to do in order to solve the problem. Right, so it's a little bit of gentle humor, puts a smile on people's face and let them know that they're human, and that's okay. And that's an important path towards being able to solve problems. We'll tie that into classroom demonstrations. And what happens often when students look at this is they just don't recognize it, right? It looks weird. But the skill of what we call chemical synthesis, how would you make this from simpler things? That's a skill they all have and they all know how to do. And so the demo that I guess adds a little bit of surprise is after we go through a lecture covering a lot of chemistry, I'll pull out a sandwich of some complexity like a tough molecule. And I'll call down some volunteers. You can see there's some periodic table beach towels here. There's the Chem 14D toolbox that has all the ingredients they need, and the ingredients are the equivalent of what we call functional groups. And the students will have a couple of laughs. They'll try to build these sandwiches, and they'll do it in front of everybody just to help them realize that they have the fundamental skill, and we'll use the element of surprise in a pretty unusual demo to, again, lighten the mood and let the students have a little bit of fun in the class. I was actually able to find an old video clip of this particular lecture. And again, context is everything, as we heard in the prior talk. So hopefully you can see, at least from the clip, that at least the students are having fun and they enjoy this presentation.
Okay, what do you guys need in there? I think that's bologna. He sees bologna. That's like confusing a hydroxyl group for a bromide, guys. You know, you don't want to do that in a synthesis problem.
Right, so again, just having, something they're not expecting. Students are a little bit confused. They're trying to figure out how all this stuff on the back of the board relates to the sandwich, and they start to see hints of that. I'll point out, it also is usually a crowd pleaser to give students these periodic table beach towels, and ultimately these turn into trophies, if you will, where you will see students like Edgar here wearing his periodic table beach towel across the UCLA campus. Another one that I wanted to show you that's really been a fun one is an assignment where we ask students or give them the opportunity to make music videos about organic chemistry. And we started to do this back in 2010. At the time, it was uncommon. And I'll even say that maybe it was a little controversial among some of my colleagues. But ultimately, this turned out to be a really fun and I think important and valuable project. Over 600 of these videos from my students alone are online, and they've been viewed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times around the world. You can find them on YouTube, but if you just want to watch some of the best ones, I'll just point you to this tiny URL, which is 14D videos, or you can go to my website and you can find these as well. But be careful, they're kind of addictive and they're really quite fun, right? I think I'd like to spend most of the rest of the time just showing you one of these videos. And as you watch this, I'd ask you to keep in mind this negative, frightening reputation of organic chemistry, if you will. And then as you watch, see if Seda, Laura, Michael, and Andy from several years ago, see if they show that they've learned anything in making this video. See if you can find their intellect and creativity. Also, by the way, important to me is teamwork. And then, see if you laugh at all. See if you think there's humor in this, and think about what it is that does for the students who made this video and anybody who watches it. Okay. So hopefully the technology will work here, and we'll go ahead and we will play it.
Same class, but it feels just a little bit harder now. My head filled with material, but it all seems the same. When my friends talk chem, all it does is just tear me down. 'Cause my heart breaks a little when I see my grade. I just feel so confused. All heart's too hard to memorize. just yet, we can work this out, yeah. Still got something left to prove. Weeks going by, I should really drop soon. I swear I studied every day. I just wanted an A. It's not much of a chance you're given. It's not just something you drop to give in. Oh, round and around to the ground we go. Oh, tell me how to be a cam hero. Cause I should have bought a clicker. Not talked in class. Should have gone to office hours instead of nap. Completed all the problem sets before I had to cram. Now my grade is dropping, cause I can't ace that exam.
Andy, what's up, man? Man, I don't sound this OCAM, man. Andy, listen, it's never too late to turn things around. You know what your problem is? You're playing all these sad songs, man. Let me show you. You need to play songs more like this. Watch out. This one right here goes out to all the Chem 14D students. And the one and only, Neil Garg. What up? UCLA, what's up, baby? Hey, lie. See, OChem gets pretty hard at times, but we can break it down for you. First up, SM2.
Backside that attack, inverse it what it can, what it could, what it won't, what it wouldn't. Looking for a better way to hit another mechanism, getting on the DMF and acetone wagon. New neck, alkene chopping, little bit of ozone, little bit of solvent.
Dichloromethane, D-miss rocking, gotta be.
Yep, ozone analysis. Yes, alk, each splitting, my O, double bonded. I got this, Neil Garg's way.
Retro sick?
Child's play.
2 steps, I shed LGs to make the carbo, kept my nucleotide. And that's what? Dying, oh fire, let that heat come down. I got that deals, all the cyclohexene, wow, easy. Breaking the bonds to form some new compounds. But I got that CCl4Br2 bromonium.
Trust me, all my MARKOV and IKOV, it's anti.
Chasing dreams and taking 14B, no more fussing. Chilling with my notes up in my back, crushing. Ladies, be back, our hero moment. Tonight is the night, right for 90 and over. So we raise our hands up, see us 50 can't hold us. Neil Garg can't fail us. Ladies, be back, our hero moment. Tonight is the night, right for 90 and over. So we raise our hands up, see us 50 can't hold us. Neil Garg can't fail us.
Okay, so at least I can see Vic getting a good laugh out of this. You know, the awkward thing over Zoom talks, right? You can't quite tell how the audience reacts, but I hope you could see that, you know, as you start that video, you don't really know where it's going. They're just being funny, and then it goes pretty hardcore into chemistry, and then they make it funny again. And I hope, you know, for those of you who are not chemists, you can appreciate they mastered material, they were smart, they were creative, and sure enough, they made us laugh, and they got a little bit of extra credit for it. I think what's also important, though, is that you can imagine if you have 400 students making videos like this and going through these experiences where they're laughing together and being part of that experience, they're building community, you're increasing approachability. And I can define that in several ways, but certainly the subject is becoming more approachable and the student engagement is also increasing, and the humor is, I think, very much tied into that. I also had a quote from a student recently, and it was a really interesting one. It commented on, you know, how professors are usually a little bit scary, and then you add on to it that organic chemistry is scary. But the aspect where the teachers are there smiling and laughing alongside of the students can also be a motivating factor and can also lead to student empowerment. And so I put this forward to offer that, you know, when you put these things together, including humor, it is about empowerment. And then we want students to go off and to be able to solve those tough problems. And so in the final example, I just want to mention briefly about exams. when I think about my exams for science classes in college, I guess I don't want to think about them. They were hard. They were definitely not funny. And I guess I don't even want to think about it. And so then you think about what our students go through, and I look at one of my own exams. We'll give students molecules like this, okay? And please take my word for it, these are tough. And we'll ask students, how do you make them using the rules of organic chemistry that you've learned? They can take really tiny building blocks and try to make something bigger, or they can use something we call the Chem 14D toolbox, which we had an analogy of as a cooler in that demo you saw earlier. And then again, our weak attempt at humor here is to incorporate the toolbox with the little fragments that the students may or may not need, but they can use these. But is it okay on an exam for there to be a cartoon of a sandwich in the toolbox? You know, I think when I was a student, I don't know what I would have done, but here we see students laughing and smiling while they're taking an exam. So I think it's okay to do this. We do it. And we do see it put a smile on people's face, and hopefully it reminds them that it's okay, that these are tough problems. They can panic, they can relax, they have the skills to be able to solve these problems. Okay, so the outcomes I think are pretty cool. Students learn how to do this. Typically 2/3 of the class can solve problems like these. And again, I just want to point out that these are second-year students, not majoring in chemistry or biochemistry. And just for comparison, I didn't learn how to solve problems like this until I was a graduate student at Caltech, right? And the other thing that I think is pretty cool is to look at the student interest in the subject. You can see that's completely transformed. 2/3 of the class now at the end say that their interest in the subject is high. Some say medium, and just a handful say that their interest is low. Okay, so I hope, again, you can appreciate how we can take, this classically feared course and this topic, organic chemistry, and using a combination of things, of course, the intellectual challenge, care and support, but also a lot of fun and a lot of laughter along the way, and turn it into a class that's become pretty popular on the UCLA campus. This message, of course, is not one that needs to be restricted to the classroom. I won't say much except to say that we have a lot of fun using humor in other ways to go beyond the classroom. You can see one image here of Elmo being levitated by a bunch of helium balloons. This is at a local school here in Los Angeles. And man, kids think this is hilarious, but they're also learning about the density of gases, right? And then on the right, just a little bit of a hint, my daughters and I have been writing chemistry coloring books. And then recently, 2 of my coworkers in the research lab thought it'd be fun to have an adult version, which we think is pretty funny. So you can see Cheesy the mouse learning about ethanol and things like hangovers and whatnot. And this coloring book will be out soon. Whenever it is out, Victoria, if you remind me, I can get copies sent to the students in the class, and I hope people will laugh at it and enjoy it. And so I'd just close by saying, what is humor? I think it's a powerful teaching tool. I hope you agree. It's a pathway to approachability and engagement. It's a way to build community, and it's a vehicle to overcome preconceptions. And then as a teacher, a mentor, a husband, and a father of 4, I can say that humor can be used in many different circumstances, and it can be incredibly powerful in helping people surmount obstacles and helping people achieve their personal best. So thank you very much, Victoria. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Neil. I suspect that I speak not just for myself, but I would imagine like the students of 10 questions are ready to sign up for organic chemistry right now. I know I am, as long as I can be assured that you're teaching the class. And on a more serious note, I wonder, like, do your students ever mistake a sandwich later on for a chemistry equation, or are they okay with food?
I hope most of them are okay with it eventually. But I in all seriousness, I do hope that when they see things like a sandwich, it reminds them that they're, maybe they smile a little bit. They have some fond memory of the class, and hopefully they remember that feeling of invincibility and know that they can solve tough problems.
Well, I'm quite sure that among other things, they understand how much you love what you do, because that seems quite apparent. So I want to thank each of you for sharing your thoughts on humor. And I want to invite all three of you to join me here so that we can take some time to reflect on what we've just heard, and for each of you to have an opportunity to respond to one another's presentations.
Yeah, I guess it was the first. I guess I'll ask the first question. So I think, I mean, I see a theme between all of ours in the sense that we all kind of touched on, like, there's the relationship that the speaker builds with the audience, whether that audience is the classroom or somebody in a big hall, in a performance center. It seems like that's in some ways, like for me, that's the most fascinating, because that's where the art comes in. And that's where it's, from the psychologist perspective, it's the hardest to understand. I guess lots of different questions, but I'll just go to the first. So I guess for Dominic, since Dominic's kind of overlapped most of mine in this sense, I'm just fascinated by there's a common theory in psychology about humor, the most popular one at the moment, called benign violation, that we laugh at things that kind of violate our comfort, but not too much. And if you go too much, then it becomes offensive or it becomes scary. And I thought that was interesting. We had some comments about the bilingual stand-up routine that that some people found that cringeworthy, or that was uncomfortable. And it made me wonder, like, a little bit. I mean, from the audience perspective, the audience is going to be a diverse group with a lot of different expectations and context people are bringing in. What, from a performance, like art or performance standpoint, what does the person in front of all those people do to connect with people in such, with such different backgrounds, to, I guess, maximize the number of people who see it as, who get the social commentary, or whatever the goal of the performance is, and not go, I guess, too far to the cringe side.
Yeah, I think part of the thing which I've been looking at a lot recently has to do with the audience and the times that they're in. So, I'll pick on like some iconic African-American comedians in some big ways. So, like Richard Pryor made fun of himself, but he made fun of himself in the 70s. And then as you moved into the 70s and 80s, and then when you moved into the 80s and 90s, you had somebody like Eddie Murphy or Chris Rock who are commenting and making fun of other people. And the 80s and 90s became this other thing about the relationship of not just who I am, but, I don't want to say mocking my community in some way. I think the cringeworthy nature of it is part of, I think we talked about this briefly, like how one frames the conversation in a contemporary audience space. Like I thought that, Angela Johnson's, big takedown about being bilingual is that she wasn't bilingual. And so she was making fun of herself. So I didn't think she was in any way mocking the nature of it. But I also realized, and this is the other thing which I think culture becomes really important, is, and this, Vicky, you mentioned this as well, is who gets to watch that? Who gets to watch that? Like, am I showing something about a community that I'm not supposed to share in some particular way? And, what does that tension, how does that tension elicit, some stuff? I mean, I think probably the modern comedian who does it the most, it might be Dave Chappelle, where, a lot of people, and Chappelle himself was like, oh, wait a second, I've crossed a line. I don't really think that that's funny anymore. And I think that that's one of those challenges. I do think that as we've moved through time, our understanding of comedy has changed, particularly stand-up comedy. But I also think that the line is a compelling one. I mean, I think it's, it's funny. Now I'm just thinking about Neil's thing. Like Neil has an audience, not that you're a comedian, Neil, you're a professor, but you're very funny. But there was a common concern. There's a common space where all those students are like trying to learn organic chemistry. When people come to comedy shows, people come in different boxes out of different things, and I think that it's hard to measure. I will tell you a horrible story about a friend of mine who is a stand-up comedian. When we were in New York, he actually came out here. He became a writer on a television show, and this is in the 80s. And he had all these jokes, and he went to this bar the wild horse. Anyway, he was his bar, and he had all these jokes, and a lot of these jokes were like these sexually based jokes. And the night that he's at the bar, there are a lot of lesbian bikers in the bar. And so I'm in the back of the house saying, I don't think that this is going to go well. And I'm trying to signal him that this is not going to go well. And he started his routine, and he, got out there with his life, and that was all. I mean, it was just amazing that he survived. But part of this thing goes to your question, is like, what is your audience and how are you talking to them? I had a question for you, Neil, though, serious, a real question about teaching organic chemistry. And this is partially asking you, like, as a comedian, and I know, Scott, you've had conversations with comedians, like, when did you develop the whole, like, 14D toolbox sandwich thing? Like, when did you work out the material? Did you work it out in grad school? Did you work it out? Like, where did you, because comedians get to go and they work on sets every night and try to perfect their material. How did you build out your material? Yeah.
Honestly, I did it all on the fly. And something that I didn't talk much about is the research side of things were so intense, so that the first time I went and taught one of these large classes, it was it's like getting thrown into the Shark Tank. You have all these really bright students, they're asking all these great questions. You're a relatively new professor, you have not taught in front of hundreds of people, you just go in blind. And I think what happened to me, as far as I can remember, is one, definitely feelings of being out of my league, if you will. And then, but once I realized it's when the crowd is with you, that's a very powerful thing. And it made me want to do more. And so I worked with the teaching assistants to say, every week we should do a demo. That turned out to be a little bit of overkill, right? But the sandwich demo I did the first time we taught, and it was just students were struggling. So it was just a thought, how do we have a demonstration, an analogy to let them know that they know how to do this? And so basically I started doing it from the first year, and then every year I tweak it, right? And every year it gets a little bit smoother, and I can make the connection a little bit more clear. I think maybe one of the points that I think it was Scott mentioned this, sorry, I have my notes here, was talking about confusion and surprise. And I think that sandwich demo was one where if you don't do it right, it leads to confusion, right? Well, why is he making a sandwich? It's kind of funny, but what's he doing? And so really have to make the analogies really clear. And that's why I showed that video clip, to show that, it's understanding that correlation between the ingredients and the functional groups. If students don't get that, the whole thing falls apart. But I think that sometimes I did that demo, to get back to Dominic's question, I think sometimes the confusion, got a little, that's the one concern. And so over time perfected it. So it's kind of a year after year working on these demos led to improvements.
So maybe students.
No, I'm sorry.
No, I was just imagining that students come to your class in anticipation of the sandwich section.
But hopefully they have no idea what it is. And yeah, and it's never the same. We have different volunteers. It's a different sandwich. There's a different problem that it's being correlated to. Oh, and okay. Yeah, hopefully it still works out. But yeah, thankfully there's been some photographs of it, and people hopefully think it's unusual. And maybe for things that both Dominic and Scott talked about, it is that element of surprise that helps to make it fun and funny for those who are in the class, and then ultimately make the real subject matter that I'm trying to get to a little bit more relatable.
No, I was just thinking.
I wanted.
You always see comedians after, like Wanda Sykes. I mean, a bunch of comedians are like talk about perfecting their routines or their 5 minutes and how hard it is to get it right. And then you're like, I'm using your class. It's like, oh, the sandwich should be bologna. The sandwich should be pastrami. You know what I mean? Like, and they'll change a word and they'll change an idea, and it's really interesting to watch comedy grow. That was all. It's great. Yeah.
Scott, you were going to say something. There you go.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, so my earbuds are going in and out. Yeah, I'm sorry, I think I interrupted too. I was just going to ask, and this is more of a personal kind of question, but I know there's a lot of people who are educators, and also they do improv. Have
you tried that? Are you busy with chemistry?
Can you repeat that, Scott? We lost you for a moment.
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just gonna have to take my earbuds out. I think it's confusing my computer.
I was just asking, I know this is more of a personal level, but have you considered or done improv? I don't remember if you mentioned that before this.
Maybe, you know, I'm around 4 children all day, every day with Zoom, I guess, you know, Zoom schooling. So maybe that's the closest I've come. I have thought about, in all seriousness, at some point.
Movement.
I think it'd be fun. I don't know, Dominic, is there a class I can audit?
Yeah, we do have. Yeah, come and take an improv class. Yeah.
One of the things that, oh, sorry, Dominic, I'll jump in
go
just
Vicky,
to say,
Vic.
is just the way in each of your talks, this idea that humor calls us in. It brings us into this space where we can't, I mean, we may not feel like the joke is funny, haha, but I feel like it's particularly in your class, Neil, I think it calls everyone in, and particularly in the university, that the class isn't the, you know, the boring, dull stuff, and then I go live my life. But actually, it's a place where we're called in, and we're called in by Gregory Campbell. Did I get his name wrong? Godfrey Cambridge. We're called in by his jokes. We're called in by Angela. So I just wonder about that, the way that it invites us to be more present with one another, particularly in moments of complexity. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Scott, did you?
Oh, I'm
Scott,
looking straight at Scott. I know you can't tell.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was that to me? I'm sorry. I was going to let anybody answer that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, humor definitely brings us in. I mean, it's like it's a group activity. I mean, you're not supposed to laugh by yourself. I mean, there have been a lot of studies that have looked at this too. I mean, laughter is contagious. I mean, that's a cliche, but it's true that. I mean, studies have looked at, you know, the more people you're around, the more likely you are to laugh. The closer you are to the people, both, you know, physically and just socially, the more likely you are to laugh. And I think, I mean, I mentioned briefly during my talk that there's an evolutionary component to that. And I mean, part of it is just because laughter is a very primitive behavior. You know, if you just think about laughter itself, and it goes back before there were humans, and we basically co-opted this tool, laughter, as a social communication mechanism to let the person next to you know that, you know, everything is good. I feel socially comfortable with you. We may be having an awkward moment, but I like you and accept you, kind of thing. I mean, if you're a monkey or an ape, you know, you don't have that, or you have some grunting, but your alternative to grunting is hitting each other with sticks. And so we've basically, you know, figuring is in the society, we're better off, you know, adopting this grunting behavior as a social communication tool rather than hitting each other with sticks. It's become a way to kind of keep society, you know, a nonverbal communication tool for keeping society together. To get really broad.
Yeah, I always think, I mean, the strange thing about its collective nature, or what I view as the collective nature of laughter, is that it's essential, but it often does, you know, that euphemism, you laugh to keep from crying, is actually probably true. The notion that you come across something, you come towards something that is painful, and maybe this is, you know, to even think about, Neil, in your class, like the students who laugh the hardest might be the ones who are the greatest confused. And even if they don't get, you know, the opening, you know, the intellectual opening, the fact that they see an opening, they laugh really hard at some moment. And I just think it's that notion of laughing to keep from crying is based, I mean, it's not just based in, you know, whatever African-American comedic writing, but a lot of people who write about it talk about the human function, the human ability to laugh in the face of despair, the ability in the side of disappointment to find humor. And I do think that that's not necessarily the beginning of humor. Like, I don't think humor has to come out of despair, But my only point is that like approaching pain or confusion or anguish or something is the place where you're like, oh yeah, that's quite funny. You know, I mean, there's a moment of humor in that. I mean, I hate to go to Richard Pryor again. I think about him, you know, doing a routine about almost burning up, or, you know, Moms Mabley doing routines about really old men she was married to, which are ridiculously funny, but there's this kernel of truth in what she's saying. It's really bizarre on how the pain and the presence are there for us. Yeah.
I don't want to leave this discussion, but we have just one more facet of this evening to move to. So I am going to make a transition here. We're all going to take a little break for the next 12 minutes. We'll keep it short. We're going to consider what we've heard, and we want to hear your questions. Students, you're off to your small group discussion rooms. If you don't have the link, it's posted in the chat. Please go there now. And to the rest of our guests, we invite you to stay put right where you are and enjoy this evening's mid-event programming. And meanwhile, the speakers and I will leave you to that and return shortly. Thank you. I think we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I want to jump right to them. My first question for our guests, here we go. Let's get you all out here with me. Out here, up here, on here. Not sure of the preposition. Is there always a place for humor? Someone asks. A great question. Or is there ever a place where humor is not appropriate?
I'll give the very short answer. One of the most silly scientific studies of all time, I think, actually tried to measure the time between tragedy and when you can joke about it, and use various like the Challenger incidents and 9/11, and calculated that it was 2.5 days per person killed when you can joke about it. Which I'm not putting validity on it. I think it's interesting that they actually tried to measure it. There's definitely a buffer time. I think it depends a lot on the person, but maybe averages a 2.5. I don't know.
Other thoughts about that?
It's interesting that there's a time that's been studied and correlated to it, but I was going to just say too soon. You know, that's some things are just too soon. I think it's not always appropriate.
It's also contextual. I mean, I hate to say it, when my father passed away, we had some really good laughs, not almost immediately, but we went back to the house and but it was just us. It was 4 people, 5 people, laughing like uproariously about things. So I think audience is a big piece of it. That's what I was gonna say, audience.
Mm-hmm. I have another question for you all. Because we're doing so much on Zoom, how does humor translate to the Zoom platform? How's it going for you?
Humor is really hard in Zoom. Colin Quinn has a special that's coming up. I think it's on Netflix, in which they do it in public, and it's a stand-up show, and people in their cars, and they flash their lights and they do some stuff. The hardest thing about Zoom is you don't know how it's landing, how anything is landing. So it's really hard to do humor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit outside of this forum that, I mean, so much of humor is building a relationship between the comedian and the audience, whether that's a teacher and a student, or a comedian and people and behind the in front of the stage. And so if you can't see each other, that's a killer. So I mean, I'm sure it can be done if you're really good, but it just takes away the biggest tool you have, which is the feedback you get between any members of a relationship.
Related to that, Neil, some students, I think, in a very self-interested and appropriate way, are wondering if you might give lessons to other professors at UCLA to help them use humor in the classroom. And if so, well, I'd like to sign up, but could you please let us know your thoughts on training the rest of us?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It's nice of the students, whoever asked that. I'll say that I learned just as I started my career and first started teaching, that faculty have their own ways of doing things. So if people ask me how I do things or want to audit my class, I'm all for it, but I definitely go with the lead by example mentality rather than anything else. But yeah, I'm happy. I work with a lot of the young faculty in the department, and I'm always happy to give them advice, audit their classes. And one of the most common things I tell them is to just lighten up and be yourself. And that's something I struggled with when I first started, is just, I'm supposed to be the serious professor in front of the room, but I like to have a good time too. So why can't you do both and blend the two? So in the absence of giving instruction to other faculty, I would say that would just be my general advice. Most of us do have a good sense of humor, and I think it's okay to share that with our students. We just have to be tactful about it. There's some rules that we have to play within for that. But thank you for the question.
But I don't want you to get away from this. You're being humble. I mean, the thing is, you're playing like a stadium, Neil. It's like other professors have seminars. So it's like playing 400 students. I actually think I'm just thinking about large classes, large lecture classes. There might be some technique you could give that, I don't know. I haven't taught, well, I teach 80, but I think 400 people, that's just a lot of people. It's like a stadium. It's like, that's big. It's great. Yeah. There might be some technique stuff you can share.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I like, for example, how each of us could apply differently a sandwich technique in our classes. Okay. Jumping back though to, everything from your father's passing and the humor to knowing when it is okay to start making jokes. A student asks, what are your thoughts on using humor as a coping mechanism? And related to that, and Scott, I think you're going to have something to say about this, can we alter some part of the brain in order to help people who are suffering from depression in terms of accessing humor? I don't know about altering the brain, but you take it away.
Yeah, I mean, humor has a huge impact on psychological health and physical too. I mean, we didn't really get into it.
And did I lose my mic?
Yeah, you lost your mic.
This is stupid. Okay, I'm not going to do the earphones anymore. So humor has some real benefits, but it has psychological, implications too. But it really depends on how you use it. So I forget where we've talked about, like Rodney Dangerfield and some of these comedians. Some of the very dark comedians, I mean, they can get away with it because they're pros. But if someone like me, a true amateur, if I tried to use that, that would probably have negative implications on my, psychological health. But if you use a positive, just, the way most of us use humor, then yeah, there's been a lot of studies showing it leads to improved, just happiness, less anxiety, pretty much everything you can imagine. The only thing it doesn't do, and this is a little weird, is it doesn't actually make you live longer, because it's hard to always keep the humor positive, and we tend to let that negative humor slip in. And I think that has negative effects too.
Would you say that humor is only successful if both the speaker and the receiver perceive it as funny?
For me, I guess for me, I look at humor as a relationship. So probably so. I mean, we've all been part of humor that, you as the listener, you didn't find funny, maybe because you find it offensive, or you're in the other role, you're telling a joke and no one laughs. I mean, it's really tough. It's about building a relationship, and this is where the art comes in. Maybe somebody else has other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think relationship is part of it. Scott, did you finish your thought? Did you finish? I was gonna say, because I think part of it's relationship, but I also think it has to do with, like, expectations and where your reality situates itself. So I think that sometimes people of different levels of privilege have different relationships to humor. And I think this could be, like, I think there are cultural implications to this. so that I'm trying to make it really simple. Like if you're poor or working class, certain things can be funny to you, but if somebody's wealthy telling you that joke, it's not really funny. I think Eddie Murphy was quoted as saying once when he was coming back, he said, it's really hard because a lot of people don't find humor in stories about Rolls Royces and private jets. Like there's not humor in that. And so there's a different connection. There's a different reality that happens. I also think it has to do with people's expectations. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to think about what's funny, I guess it has to be funny to you and it has to be funny to me. But the other thing that I have to deal with is if it's funny to you, well, then it is funny in a way. I can be offended, but it can still be funny to you.
I just wanted to add, I live on the UCLA campus, which is absolutely awesome. And I just see a lot of people, and normally not during COVID times, of course, but it's pretty often I'll just see a student laughing and smiling, thinking about whatever they're thinking about as they're walking across campus. I'm sure I'm guilty of it too. So to get to that question of, I think sometimes I can have some memory. I'm by myself and I'll be laughing and it'll put a smile on my face. So I'll just say I obviously for what I do for teaching, I think that the humor, it's about that relationship, but there are some moments of humor where it can be by oneself and it can, impact somebody's mood.
Can you speak more on the difference between positive and negative humor? And how does that affect us psychologically?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of different categories of humor. I mean, the negative humor would be the self-effacing kind of humor. But I mean, this maybe gets at the last question too, that it really depends on how you approach it. I mean, if you approach negative humor and you really are being negative, I mean, I don't think that's what the pros do, like a Don Rickles or Rodney Dangerfield. I mean, these comedians, there was always the message behind the words in a sense. Maybe there wasn't, if for you, you didn't connect with it for that reason. But I mean, most of the time, the comedian, there's a message behind it. But a truly negative humor would be the kind where you're just insulting someone for its own sake, not, with nothing deeper behind it. And sometimes that goes in racist or sexist directions too. There's a lot of different ways you can do humor badly. I guess that's where it stops. That's where you're actually defining where is, at what point does it stop being humor and start being something else, I guess. And that's hard to define for negative humor or when it, at any point where those transition points between positive and negative exist.
I also think one of the things about negative humor, and we talked about this briefly before, the person who's giving the jokes are part of it. Like if Don Rickles is insulting you, but he looks like looked like Don Rickles, as opposed to looking like a strapping, handsome, whatever you call it, it becomes something else. If Sophia Loren is telling Phyllis Diller jokes, they become entirely different. You know what I mean? They become entirely different. Phyllis Diller, great comedian, but just, Sophia Loren is Sophia Loren. And so I think that the vessel of delivery for the insult humor I'm talking about is particular.
Absolutely. Just anyone Google some of Betty White's stuff. And I mean, she makes her humor. I'll laugh out loud for her more than almost any other comedian because it's her. And she can throw the most raunchy stuff out there. This isn't necessarily negative humor, but it's an example of it. Depends on who's saying it.
I have one last question for us, and let's keep it short so we can wrap this up. But it's a great question. If humanity, and you're standing in for humanity, had to choose one funniest thing, what do you think it would be? That's like the great riddle of the Sphinx.
Okay, this is going to get, somebody's got to go first. I'll do it badly. There is some quote, if I was faster with Google, I would look it up. But some ancient philosopher said the greatest joke on humanity is mortality itself. And that, I mean, that's maybe too dark or deep for a talk like this. I don't know. And I'm butchering the quote, but I mean, there's something that is humorous about recognizing our place in the universe and how unbelievably small it is. And to me, I think all humor, the big humor kind of gets to that. At least the deep humor does. But I like some jokes.
I'm gonna go to a comedian who is my son, and kids have these things, and it's his go-to joke. So this might not be the funniest thing in the universe, but it's his go-to joke. What's the difference between broccoli and boogers? You can't get kids to eat their broccoli. You got that from me. And that's I don't know if that's the greatest thing in the world. It is his go-to joke, and he's my son, and I think that's where I'm leaving that.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to dare to. I don't know if I want to dare to try to answer this question. I think, you know, my children are hilarious, and that is a very important part of my day in my life. You know, there's 1,000 things that go wrong, and a kid is happy and funny, and it's a really wonderful thing. And as you saw, I'm also a big fan of Will Ferrell. So I'll put out Will Ferrell there just in general. Though, you know, I can watch any Will Ferrell movie on repeat and I will still laugh again and again at it. And Elf, it would be a perfect example, just as we're gearing up for the holidays.
Well, not gearing up for the holidays quite, but gearing up for the end of an evening. Last thoughts, comments, just anything you want to leave us with. I mean, broccoli is sort of a great way to leave us, but you might have more to say than the world's best joke.
Because I feel like mine was a little too dark. I'll throw out, there was actually a study that asked people around the world to share jokes and rate them. And, you know, rated what's the funniest joke. The funniest joke, according to the study, was way too long to share here. But the most common one, this is the most common joke in the world, is what's brown and sticky? A stick. Which I think is if you ask people anything, you're going to tend towards mediocrity. But that was the most common joke in the world.
Dominic,
you know, the one thing. No, I think the one thing that I gotta say is, I mean, I know people might not find certain things funny, but I think that what you should do, what a human being should do, is try to go towards funny. Like they should really, you know, and I know, you know, Neil was talking about his kids. When your kids laugh, or when somebody laughs, even if that's laughing at nothing, you're just like, wow, that is so wonderful. So I think human beings should just drift towards funny in the way plants drift towards the sun. We should try to continually drift towards the funny if possible.
And I'll just leave with something that's one can do in social circumstance or for conversation. I think someone say, hey, what happened in your day, and talk through things like that. Sometimes people talk about their highs and their lows. I think just a very simple variation on it that can be really fun is just to say, tell me something funny that happened in your day. And even if somebody repeats it and it's not funny to you, it is usually hilarious to them, which is kind of funny just to watch anyway. So I'd say just offer that. It's a way to, you know, especially I think times are tough for a lot of people. It's a pretty fun way to brighten up the mood. Think about those fun things that happen, fun and funny things that happen during the day, and share this with each other.
What a beautiful set of gifts to end this evening with. I want to thank you all for being here with us tonight and for this consideration of humor. This concludes this evening's program, and we hope you'll join us again next week for, wait for it, What is Loss? I'm serious. What is Loss? Same time, new link. And to learn more about the entire series or to RSVP, visit arts.ucla.edu/10 questions. Thank you. Thank you to our guests. Thank you all for being here. Until next week, good night.